Ready.
Okay, hello everyone. This is the Anthroperspective series number 5, and today I'm really excited to have Alana Jordan with us. Alana Jordan is a business anthropology. You have your PhD from Stanford, is it?
Correct, yes.
Correct. And she works at Google. In people analytics, she is the head of qualitative research for people analytics at Google. So I'm really excited to talk to you today. So why don't we start by you telling everyone a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your career path and what you're doing now at Google.
Sure, great. Well, thank you first, Keith, for inviting me to be a part of this series and these conversations. So it's always exciting to, connect with other anthropologists and, hear their perspectives and just learn from them. So thank you for inviting me to participate. So a little bit about myself. So I guess I have always sort of been an anthropologist, both at heart and in actual, like my career choices and education. In undergrad, I started off in the biological and physical anthropology side of the world.
Mhm.
And so I studied that and also minored in bioarchaeology.
Mhm.
So I thought I was going into forensics for a while. And then,
That would have been exciting.
It would have been. I mean, I still sometimes like geek out around like bones and skeletons and stuff. So
Yeah, absolutely.
it's certainly still a possibility. But I did some deeper soul searching. I was like, well, maybe this is like not quite it. It's super interesting, but maybe not quite what I want to do in terms of like my long-term career. And so I started kind of questioning and thinking about like what are the other opportunities within anthropology, and thank goodness that it's so broad and there's so many topics and things to explore, which is one of the reasons why I love anthropology so much. But yeah, I started looking into medical anthropology and thinking about health and impacts of health and culture and how we think about the health in the human body. And so when I started my PhD program at Stanford, it was a little bit, we didn't have a medical anthropology track then, but we did have a track called ecological and environmental anthropology. And so that was more centered around evolutionary perspectives and sort of human behavioral ecology. So kind of going back to my roots in physical and biological anthropology. And so I started studying it under that track. And about halfway through my program, when I was conducting my fieldwork in Colombia, I became really more interested in absorbing and engaging with the sociocultural side of anthropology. And, I had realized that I've sort of neglected a lot of that throughout my career, but I was like, it was blaring and so obvious and so important to the work that I was doing for my dissertation that I was like, okay, I need to, I need to switch gears a little bit. And so when I started looking into sociocultural anthropology, it kind of just opened a whole new world for me. So I'm sort of newer on the sociocultural side of anthropology, but it certainly has been with me along the way. So yeah, and so now I am, as you mentioned, I'm at Google. I'm not quite the head of qualitative and ethnographic research of people analytics. I wish, perhaps one day, soon, with some more time. But I'm essentially the qualitative and ethnographic expert there on the team, the resident anthropologist. And so oftentimes a lot of what I do is consulting and advising on research projects that want to have a qualitative component. So understanding how do we glean, really rich insights from the findings from qualitative research, because I think sometimes it can be really challenging to, people are like, what do we do with this? What do we do with these words, these expressions, right? And so I really try to help folks make sense of qualitative research. And so, I mean, people analytics, our goal is to make work better. And so we use social science research to understand how we can do that. And it's been a really interesting journey so far, just applying my skill set in a totally different way.
That's great. That is really great. It's interesting because I've been going to the people analytics meetups. There's been one in San Francisco and one in New York. And at one of them, I was kind of surprised because they brought up the importance of qualitative research. Now, people analytics tends to be quantitative heavy. I mean, every time you read a people analytics job description, it's Python, SQL, R,
Yep.
all of these, heavy, experience with big data and all of these different things you have to do. But the team that, are actually in the people analytics field are saying we need qualitative researchers, we need people to go out and actually talk to people, we need to gather their feedback. Yes, we have data, but just because we have data doesn't mean that, they're going to they have enough to make the right decisions and going forward.
Right.
And there's a lot of interpretation behind it. And I was sitting there, of course, virtually, and I'm going, oh my gosh, they're talking about it. I was so excited. So, as an anthropologist myself, I have to say that people analytics space is a space where I would love to be. And I would love to be, doing qualitative research like you're doing, or, setting up that kind of thing, because I think that's what, it's like two wings of a bird, right? One is quantitative and one is qualitative, right? And I think that if we just have a little more qualitative in the people analytics field, I think we're going to have so much more robust and more informed information we need to make decisions. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I completely agree 100%. I love the analogy of like the wings on a bird, because I really think that the two can really work together in a really beautiful way to create this balance and create this more holistic picture and perspective that we're often missing when we're only looking at just qualitative research, or when we're only looking at just quantitative research. And so I think the weaknesses in both of them can be the strengths when they come together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, one of the questions I have for you is, what is the value of applying qualitative research into the people analytics space? Now, you kind of answered that, but if you could just go into a little more detail, I think that'd be great.
Yeah. I mean, I'm constantly championing the value of using ethnography and how it can produce, right? Awesome, rich insights. And I think, and you mentioned it as well, is how we can make better decisions based on that, right? Because the reality is, like, data doesn't tell us much, right? We think it tells us everything, or it's going to tell us, it's going to give us the answer, right? And it doesn't, because we only have a piece of the pie. We only have a slice of the picture. And so I think when we incorporate qualitative research, we can begin to peel back those layers and get a little bit deeper, right? So quantitative data, you kind of start to scratch the surface and you have some observations, right? But then with qualitative research, you can really get at the why we're seeing those trends. Why are we, experiencing, why are people having certain kinds of experiences, and even speak to the how, or in what ways, to some extent as well. And so again, I think it's really about like just getting deeper into problem solving, right? And being able to make better sound decisions based on a more holistic perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So have you been able to incorporate anthropological theory into your work?
Not as much as I would like to, or as I thought I come in with my, anthropology hat, and I'm just thinking about like social theory and like going back and reading like, okay, what articles do I need to like read to explain what's happening here?
Right.
Right. Exactly. Going through my course syllabus and stuff. But not as much directly into my work. It's not something that comes up in terms of when we're talking about particular kinds of findings, not as much. However, I do find myself sort of relying on Clifford Geertz a lot, and his sort of use of thick description, and just really kind of going back to the basics of that and using that as a foundation and a way to frame qualitative approaches for those who are unfamiliar with it. And so I think it's really actually, a great way to introduce people into that space. One of my first assignments, one of my first projects when I started at Google, was to create a qualitative training course and sort of introduce analysts to rigorous qualitative methods and even ethnography. And that's the perspective that I was bringing, was how do we think about ethnography? What is ethnography? And so I actually put the Twitch and the wink example in that course. And I think it was really good for people to have a concrete example of what ethnography is and what it could be.
And again, when you're teaching people about ethnography, they learn that yes, quantitative data is important, but there's more to it, right? There's
Hmm.
the qualitative research, there's stories, there's artifacts, and it goes back to your, training. Yes, artifacts are important. I mean, what kind of computer systems do people use? What kind of, visual management is hanging up, in the hall or whatever it is.
Hmm.
So yes, all those things come together. And I just think that's really important. I think it's great that you're doing that and teaching people that as well, because that just helps that much more, and that's what we do as anthropologists. We want to get a holistic picture of what's going on, not just data from one side or data from one
Exactly.
aspect.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think too, sometimes, and maybe we don't necessarily do a great job of talking about this or explaining this, but as you mentioned, we get data from different sources, and that includes quantitative sources too, right? So we don't completely exclude, just because our approach is qualitative doesn't mean we exclude the quantitative, right? We learn how to incorporate and embed it into our story, into the findings, and sort of make sense of the whole picture.
Mhm. So I noticed from your background that, you've also done work. I don't know if it was necessarily at Google, but you've also done some work in terms of the subject of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as you know, this is becoming a hot topic right now in light of, the Black Lives Matter movement. So
Hmm.
what kind of light can you shed on this? And what do you think companies need to focus on to make their DEI initiative successful?
Yeah.
It's
That
a
is a
huge,
it's a
huge
huge
question, right?
question, huge question. And I will caveat that I'm not necessarily a DEI expert, because I think specifically DEI within the business realm is very specific.
Mhm.
I do have some perspectives around racism, and inequity and inequality from an anthropological perspective.
Right.
And so yeah, so we'll just kind of caveat it with that. And so I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot that we need to do. And again, like, this is speaking for as a non-DEI in business expert, but
Right.
just simply my perspectives, just from listening to the conversations that are happening,
Absolutely.
and reading the articles and the commitments, and sort of coming away with my own sort of thoughts. I mean, I think we have a long ways to go in
Yes.
organizations. I mean, we have a long way to go in society in general.
Yes.
But I think, focusing on systems and processes is going to be very critical, as a way to move ahead. I don't think we're in this time and space where we can, no longer simply fix just one part, right? We need to
Right.
take a step back
Mhm.
and understand how all the different parts are fitting together into a
Mhm.
larger system of problems and challenges.
Right.
And so, as a researcher, for me, I think part of what we need to do is rethink our approaches, on how we collect, utilize, and even interpret demographic data.
Oh, yes.
Uh, you know,
Here we are back
there's
to the interpreting data again, right?
data. Exactly. Like this. So, from a researcher perspective, like, I think there's a way to start there.
Mhm.
I think we need to really be critical about that, and how we approach it, how we handle it, how we talk about it, and certainly, again, like, how we collect it. I think, there's an opportunity here to shake things up and do things differently. And so I would encourage organizations to challenge current practices, and
Mhm.
even consider, like, even what they would consider as benchmarks and what they
Right.
would consider as progress, to be
Right.
critical of that, and to
Right.
really rethink that, and really be creative, allow themselves to be creative in this space, because I think that's what it's going to take, right? We can no longer just, accept the status quo. And so I think, in addition to that, it's going to take strong leadership to be willing to be courageous and
Right.
step out and
Courageous.
be creative and to challenge, right, and critique. And so I think strong leadership is needed now more than ever, honestly. Yeah.
And I think too, again, qualitative research would help with that, because that involves,
Hmm.
if you do face-to-face interviews, speaking directly to people that the policies affect, right? So,
Exactly.
bringing in those people from underrepresented groups and people that fall into that DEI category, right? And talking to them exactly about, their feelings, their notions, whatever is happening is going on. Because, like what you said, the way a company benchmarks such things may be not necessarily accurate, right?
Mhm.
Because if the power structure is deciding what the benchmark is, that kind of, it sort of goes against what you're trying to do here, because obviously if there's a DEI issue, then the power structure is part of the issue, right?
Exactly. Yep.
So then they need to reach out to the ones who are underrepresented to get the benchmarks or the issues forward so that they can do better benchmarking, right? So really, the first step in DEI is inclusion, right?
Mhm.
Some people say diversity, equity, and inclusion. Well, actually, I think it should probably be inclusion first, but
Mhm.
also visibility in there as well. I mean, who is the face of their company? Who speaks at conferences? Who's heading at meetings? Who's presenting at the all team associates meeting or whatever it is that's going on. So I think it's really important as well. And that's another area that I would love to get into as well,
Yeah.
is the DEI stuff. I think that would be
Yeah.
so super great.
It's so interesting. And I mean, and speaking of inclusion, I mean, like, I think there's so much to learn there, and so what does that even mean? Inclusion and belonging, and we're talking about these things, and we're starting to get the conversations going. But I think, yeah, I mean, a big part of that is talking to the people who have been excluded for so long, right? How are they experiencing the workplace? What does it mean for them to encounter certain kinds of power structures or certain actors within a particular context? And I think, of course, qualitative research has a great way of being able to storytell and to really illuminate those marginalized voices and to get varying perspectives, and not just to get those perspectives, right? It's one thing to just capture them, but it's also another thing to interpret them and to bring meaning to them and provide them with some sort of sense making. And I think that's a great way that qualitative research can contribute.
Absolutely. So can you tell us about some insights in organizational behavior or culture that you've gained in your work and that might be helpful to others?
Yeah, sure. you know, um, I'm still pretty like new to all of this, and so I'm still learning a lot within organizational culture, and it's still it fascinates me
Oh,
every
absolutely right.
day. And again, there's so many like facets and things to explore and just to dig into, and so it's always super exciting. One of the things that I'm asked about a lot in my role is, people come to me and say, well, how do you measure culture? How do you, how do we know that culture is really changing? How do we know if it's changing in the desired direction that we want it to go into? And so, I find that they sort of want this really neat, nice answer.
Mhm.
And, sometimes with the big culture question, we think of culture with the big C as
Mhm.
this single thing. And so we try to capture it all. And, it's, I kind of have to reshift that a bit and say, well, we really can't capture everything, right? We can't really get a full, complete picture. We'll never fully know what culture is in this grand sense, this grand scheme of things. But, how can we shift that into what is the particular aspect or dimension of culture that you're interested in? How can we, approach this in a sort of not necessarily fragmented way, but in a way that feels possible and answerable,
Right.
right?
Eating the elephant one bite at a time.
Time, right? Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so, again, because culture is such a big, hot topic, and how it infiltrates and affects so many different aspects like
Absolutely.
DEI and hiring practices and norms and beliefs and policies, right? We want to know everything about it, but it's really challenging. And I even think in some ways, coming in as an anthropologist, I think I came in like, oh yes, okay, I can answer all the culture
Right,
questions.
right, right, right.
Right?
But it's the way they frame their question that it kind of like gets in your head, and it's like, no, wait a second. Let me rephrase that question for you, and then I can answer it,
Right.
right?
And then I can't, right. And so then, right, I'm kind of meeting my challenge here, meeting my match. And like, okay, wait a second. Now I need to rethink how
Yeah,
I'm thinking about culture and what it looks like in this particular setting and context.
yeah. They probably are used to, some kind of, chart or line graph showing trends. And, the definition of culture is the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors of a given population. Well, how do you
Hmm.
measure that attitudes have changed? How do you measure that behavior has changed? You know, how do you measure that beliefs have changed, you know, about certain things? And, you know, culture is always changing, right? It's always
Right.
in a state of flux. And we know one thing, change causes change in culture, right? So if you change one thing, or if you focus on one thing, there's probably going to be changes in other areas as well, because it's just the ripple effect of what's going on. So even if you try to measure it, as soon as you do, it's probably, now it's stagnant data, right?
Right.
Because things have changed already, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's you know, when we're looking at particularly like quantitative data or survey, right, we have to keep in mind that it is a snapshot. It is a moment in time. And so, as you said, like as soon as you shift something, or even if you don't intentionally shift it, right, things are going to change. Culture sort of emerges. It's constantly shifting and reshifting and manifesting itself in different nuanced ways. And so it becomes, so if we just try to single it into, you know, a set of, you know, a bound set of questions, then it's going to be really difficult and sometimes, you know, frustrating to
right.
actually be able to interpret or make sense of what's going on.
Yeah, one of the people I interviewed earlier had said that it wasn't in their interview, but they had told me another time that they had a higher up come to them and say, I need a plan on my desk first thing tomorrow morning on how we're going to change the culture. It doesn't work that way.
Right. It's like, what does that mean? There's a
What does
lot.
that mean, change the culture? Well, we've
Change
got
the
to change
culture.
the culture. Well, yes, but what exactly do you want to change it?
Mm-hmm.
What is the
Mm-hmm.
issue? And, you know, so I don't know I don't know what the end result of that story was, but, you know, it's something that, you know, of course, we face as anthropologists in the workplace as
Yeah.
well. So my next question is, what is your definition of organizational culture, and what do you think it's not?
Yeah. Yeah, there are so many different theories and definitions out there, depending on like which school of thought you're coming from. And so, you know, I agree on the general thought that it's, you know, an organizational's norms, beliefs, artifacts, shared practices, and all that. But I also would say it's even the contradiction and conflict of those things as well, right? It's about how people are navigating those experiences. It's that can even sometimes be at, you know, friction or intention with what we think is the big C culture.
Mhm.
And so it's really that interaction, that interplay between these different dynamics. It's the interplay between individual and organizational identity. It's emotive, right? There are feelings, memories involved, right? So even as an employee, you still have these expressions and experience emotional experiences throughout throughout a day, right?
Right.
throughout your journey. And so how one navigates that, how groups navigate that, how they situate themselves within particular groups in an organization. I mean, it's all of that. It's like everything,
Right.
right? And it's so dynamic, as we talked about before. It's not a single thing. It's not this unified, cohesive, you know, buzzword, right? Our culture is, you know, or it's not even, you know, a group of buzzwords, right? I think it's constantly in flux. It's dynamic. It's the process. So I guess I would say like I'm in that school of thought where, you know, culture is not something an organization has, but it is, right?
Right.
You are, as a culture, as an organization, sorry,
Mhm.
the culture,
Mhm.
right? And even the subcultures, right? There are so many
Absolutely.
layers and things that can exist simultaneously. And so it's all about, again, that tension and that push and pull
Mhm.
between like actors and ideas. So that's I guess that's my definition of culture.
Absolutely. No. And the other question I had was, what is it not? And I guess what I'm asking is, you know, what do you think are some of the myths that, you know, people misunderstand about organizational culture?
Mhm. Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that it's static, right?
Right.
Again, like how can you change the culture? Well, it's always changing,
Mhm.
right? And so I think that's like a big myth, or that there's a singular, excuse me, culture,
Mhm.
right? Rather than understanding how different cultures can exist simultaneously, and those cultures again can be subversive to what you know your to your ideas of what the main culture is.
Mhm.
I guess it's not like a brand or a tagline, right? I think
Yes,
sometimes
yes,
we
yes.
equate those as
Mhm,
well.
mhm.
Um, yeah, so I think those are some of like the biggest myths and misconceptions about culture.
Mhm. So what do you think are the top skills that anthropologists can bring to any company?
Well, I think anthropologists are really good at seeing how things are deeply interconnected. Again, going back to this idea of having different data points and different kinds of data, different sources. And so we're able to create a narrative and a theme from disparate pieces of information. And so we're really good at putting all of these things together and making sense of them. And so I guess again, part of that is storytelling, right? How do we create a good story from all these different things that seem separate and seem disjointed, right? But really are connected and related in some way or another. Um, oh, were you gonna say something?
No, no, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I also think, anthropologists are really good at illuminating different kinds of voices. So not just those on the ground, not just the marginalized voices, but those in the boardrooms as well. And so,
Mhm.
and not even just within between those groups, but within those groups as well, right? We're really good at pulling out those and exploring the range of voices that exist within groups. And so, kind of going back again to like exploring and understanding what those experiences mean in the larger picture.
Mhm.
I also think we're good at understanding structures and power dynamics at
Oh,
play
yes.
within certain structures,
Mhm.
and that is something that you know we all know it exists, and if we feel it, in the workplace, but we don't talk about it explicitly.
Right.
And so I think as an anthropologist, we're keen to those subtle dynamics around power and around structure and
Mhm.
hierarchies
Mhm.
and the impacts that they have on outcomes, on groups, on policies,
Mhm.
right? So I think those are really unique values and perspectives that we could bring.
Yeah, great, good stuff. So what do hiring managers and recruiters need to know to understand the value of the anthropological skill set?
We're really observant.
Mhm.
Um, we're observant in while many may not know about the world of anthropology, we are methodical, I think, in many ways. And so with our methodical mindset, observant mindset, we're also good listeners, right? When you're doing field work, you have to listen to a lot of stories. And I think all of that really serves as a foundation for good relationship building. And so that's a critical aspect of when you're conducting field work. In order for that to be successful, or any study really, is really about connecting people and gaining their trust so we can speak to and represent their experiences in a fair way. Um, and so I would say we're good at relationship building. I think that's really important for managers and recruiters to know. We're good at making connections and methodically processing information. We're also really quite adaptable.
Yes.
Um, and we have to be able to talk to different communities and different audiences, right? So community organizers, CEO, everyone, the managerial staff, everybody in between. And
Mhm.
so in that we're able to communicate with different audiences. And I think that's a really valuable skill set, that we're able to connect and adapt in certain situations when we need to. We're also cultural experts, obviously. It's
Absolutely.
like, that's like the big one,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Um, and so, as we're connecting people, we can really be a bridge between worlds, and
Oh,
um, and not just the worlds, but I guess connecting people and stories and ideas. And I think that's really an important skill set to have, that hiring managers and recruiters could be aware of.
yeah, I agree because, in my career, I've always noticed that, there is so much tension in the workplace among like the power structures and those that don't necessarily have the power. And then there's tension between different groups internal to the company, like,
Mhm.
engineering and accounting probably don't get along with each other. And, the help desk really doesn't like the engineers because they're too demanding or something. And, there's always these things. But as anthropologists, what we can do and what we have the talent to do is understand what the needs are of each side. And
Mhm.
maybe we can't help the negotiation, but we can at least provide good, holistic information to help smooth those pain points within the culture. So yeah, I agree with you
Absolutely.
100%. And part of the reason I'm doing this whole interview series is to help hiring managers and recruiters understand, what's an anthropology degree worth, because I've talked to so many people who, everybody thinks that, I got a degree in Indiana Jones or something,
Right.
So what does this have to
Yeah.
do with people analytics? And what does this have to do with
Yeah.
product management? And what does this have to do with organizational transformation or culture? It's like,
Mhm.
we're the original culture people, right? I mean, we're the ones, going way back, we're the ones that went off to a remote tribe in the Amazon and figured out what was going on with that culture, not even knowing the language, not even having been there before, but having that skill set and having those tools to understand very ambiguous and mysterious situations. So, I always want to help promote the field of anthropology because it helps organizations understand, like, yeah, we've got problems in our culture. If only we knew somebody. Just hire an anthropologist because they can probably figure it out. Even if they're not having experience with your particular company or your particular industry or whatever, they will probably figure out what's going on. Now, they're going to bring up things like, I remember, I keep mentioning Elizabeth Bryody, who I interviewed. She brought up that she found, this prevalence of blame, this blame culture that was in one of the companies she worked for. And the company was sort of like, yeah, well, that's really good, but we need to stick to quality. They don't necessarily want to deal with it.
Mhm.
But those are the
Mhm.
kind of things we find out. And I think anyone who cares about organizational culture will realize that blame is very destructive. And it is, they want, we want people to have more teamwork. Well, stop the blame, stop the competing, that sort of thing. That's what you need to do to bring teams together and things like that. So that's also kind of the things that we can do. Would you agree with that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just sort of jumping off of the blame, another side of that, if you will, that I've noticed as well is accountability, right? Who's
Oh, yeah.
accountable for certain decisions or
Mhm.
for upholding certain policies and norms, right? And so it's not quite blame, but it's sort of
Yeah,
a different kind of manifestation
right.
of that. And so I totally agree that being attuned to those sort of nuances and those ways of recognizing certain kind of patterns that people are not aware of because it's so embedded in their everyday.
Mhm.
And so sometimes, as an anthropologist, we kind of come in with that, even though we're in the workplace, we still come in with that external lens
Mhm.
of being an outsider in some ways, in some contexts, right? And
Yeah.
so I think that is a wonderful point. And also, like, thank you for putting this series together and
You're welcome.
showing hiring managers that recruiters that there really is some great value that can come of anthropology. And I think it's also really good to know too, as PhD students. I mean, I just completed my program about 2 years ago,
Mhm.
and didn't even think that this was a possibility. I was not aware of business anthropology as a career track or
Right, right,
possibility. So, I mean,
right.
even just opening up that conversation and showing what is possible with an anthropology degree is great for both parties. As a student coming, leaving the program and thinking about going into industry, and as hiring managers are thinking about improving their talent pool, and talk about diversity of
Yeah,
and within hiring, right? We should also get a range of different kinds of experiences and backgrounds. And so I think it's wonderful that we can have these conversations and really shine the light on what anthropology can contribute.
yeah. I mean, like, you take your first anthropology course, Anthropology 100. What do you learn? You learn about culture. immediately,
Mm-hmm.
right? You learn about race and racism immediately. You learn about gender and sex and sexism immediately.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, and then the power structures, and then the economics. I mean, that is everything in the first class. That's just the
Yeah.
first class. And, you know, that's the thing is I think a lot of companies don't realize a lot of the stuff you're looking for was our first class, you know, in anthropology ever, you know. But, you know,
Right.
when they were in college, they just missed anthropology as an elective and took, you know, something else, math or something. I don't know what they took. But,
Right. Right.
you know, so they don't know, they don't have the relationship between, oh yeah, anthropology has got this whole culture thing that we really is important here in our company. We really need, you know, sort of thing. So
Mhm.
I just want to, say, is there anything else you want to say to us? Because that's all the questions I have, and this has been a great interview. But I just want to say if there's anything else you have, advice for other people or advice for companies and hiring managers and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I guess I would kind of going back to this idea of transitioning into industry for those who have not um, you've been a part of those conversations or thought it was possible. I really think having a shared language and sort of and learning a little bit about the industry before going into it is something that really could be helpful, specifically like especially if you're like a student and you're wanting to transition careers in outside of academia. I found that like you know coming from a purely qualitative background, we speak a different language, right? And quantitative folks speak a very different language.
Mhm.
And so it can be challenging sometimes to communicate what we do and how we can contribute, how we fit into an organization, and how we can utilize our skills. And so I found that like really trying to figure out what that shared language is
Mhm.
can go a long way.
Mhm.
So, again, thinking about like how we can become bridges and connectors, right? And bringing people along the anthropological journey, right?
Right.
Is we kind of have to learn to speak their language, right?
Right.
But we also have to be able to teach them our language too, so that we can communicate, and so that's something that I'm learning. I'm
Mhm.
still learning on my journey right now and in my career. And so it's been like super fascinating, just to learn like what are the ins and outs, and like how can I broaden people's horizons around qualitative research. And so it's been great. It's been great. People are super open, and that's the exciting part. I think this is the time where folks are really opening up and saying, okay, there's some good stuff here. Teach us, like show us.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. So
great.
yeah, so that's all I have for now. So
Okay.
yeah, this has been really great. This has been an awesome conversation. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm so glad I finally got to meet you. And it's just really great. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a good
Bye.
one. Take care.